Hello and welcome back to another episode of Further Explorations, where we explore science, the near-death experience, and just a little bit of everything else. Today we're going to speak about the mystery of telepathy during the near-death experience. During the course of the experience, the individual makes communications with dead relatives, celestial beings. It seems that these communications are carried out using what we would generally consider as a form of telepathy. Now, we've decided not to use the word telepathy for the rest of the presentation and in our work due to the many negative connotations which surround it. So from now on we will refer to this as non-verbal communications. Now non-verbal communication is absolutely a primary feature of the near-death experience. In fact, it's right up there with all the more well-known features of the experience, although it generally isn't listed as such under the more popular lists of classical near-death experience features, although we believe it should be, and hopefully after this presentation you will agree. Also, we're going to speak about why is it important? Why is it important that people seem to communicate non-verbally during the course of near-death experience? Well, it's going to be extremely important in light of current neurobiological models which attempt to explain, or will in the future attempt to explain, the near-death experience. It will be something that must be accounted for. In other words, vague references on the more skeptical side of the fence to such things as chemicals, dreams, hallucinations, expectations of the individual, their ideas of death, etc., etc. In regard to the origin of the content of the experience, we'll have to take into account how these phenomena give rise to the individual speaking non-verbally during the course of the experience. For again, and as is one of the main themes of our work, we must ask ourselves what precedent in the individual's life would easily explain why they speak non-verbally during the transition between life and death, as opposed to perceiving themselves as speaking just as they had done before. It's very easy to skip over something as seemingly insignificant as this in attempting to explain the potential neurochemical or neurobiological origins of the near-death experience. But of course we can see that, or we will at least see that, it's certainly not trivial in that sense. Now, I should say that it seems that this form of non-verbal communication seems to be a transferal of entire concepts. It seems that, as opposed to the sequential nature of the spoken word, this form of communication, which the individual takes part in during the transition, it seems that in the entirety of the concept that the individual wishes to impart is put across instantaneously. There doesn't seem to be much, if any, room for misinterpretation from on the part of the receiver. This is an extremely efficient form of communication, fundamentally different from the form of communication that we use in our daily lives. Now, that non-verbal communication is a prominent feature of the near-death experience. Certainly has not been missed by researchers. This is something that has been highlighted by a number of researchers, and our only qualm is that it has never been afforded the place of importance that we think it deserves in terms of the features of the experience. And these cases have rarely been compiled, and where they have been, no real conclusions have been drawn from such a compilation. That's what we hope to do here, and there will be a document attached which will hold over 50 supplementary cases for the listener. Now let's take a look at some of those cases. We will highlight about 7 or 8 just to give the listener the general idea of what these kind of cases look like. In the first case we read that, and this is collected by Dr. Pim van Lommel, we read from one of his informants having been plunged into the world beyond our own, having almost drowned to death in his youth. But some of my ancestors were on the other side, and they caught my attention because they were communicating through a kind of telepathy. In another case we read that, for the first time he spoke to my mind in a male voice and told me that if I was uncomfortable, we didn't have to go closer. In yet another well-known case, the speaker observes the beings he communicated with as having bypassed language during communication. Thoughts entered him directly. So we can already see that there are multiple different ways in which this type of communication is described, but it is clearly the same type of communication despite the differences in language. Coming to one of Raymond Moody's experience, we hear that, while I was dead in this void, I talked to people, and yet I really couldn't say that I talked to any bodily people. Yet I had the feeling that there were people around me, and I could feel their presence, and could feel them moving, though I could never see anyone. Every now and then I would talk with one of them, but I couldn't see them, and whenever I wondered what was going on, I would always get a thought back from one of them. So here again we see the word talk and talked being used many times, but the individual himself clarifies that it wasn't actually talking. So here again we have an instance where the use of language gives us, and may give us, an impression of what happened, different from what actually occurred, and we'll speak more about that in just a few moments. Moving on for now to another case, we read that from a woman who attempted to commit suicide. It was at this moment that his family appeared in front of him, in a glow of light with an incredible sense of love. They had happy smiles on their faces and simply made him aware of their presence, not communicating in any verbal way, but in the form of thought transference. In one case, the story of Lewis Tucker, describing his own experience in his memoirs, he tells us that, soon I discovered that we were not talking but thinking. I knew dozens of things that we did not mention because he knew them. He thought a question, I an answer, without speaking. The process was practically instantaneous. Finally, we'll look at a case reported by an Anglo-Saxon monk and the medieval death experience of a well-known medieval figure, Drithelm, where we read that, I began to think this might be hell, of whose intolerable torments I had often heard tell, but my guide went before me, answered my thoughts. Rather, my guide who went before me answered my thoughts. So again, that's just a small taster of the literature, but it is absolutely representative of the entirety of the literature. And again, there are approximately 50 cases attached if the listener wants to read more. And every now and then sometimes it's imperative to just pause and consider how strange these things really are. That these individuals, all unbeknownst to each other, experience a process of transition between life and death, and in all cases find themselves, against their life experience, communicating non-verbally with those beings whom they encounter during the course of the experience. This is a fundamental mystery. So again, just like our piece on the inability of the individual to communicate with those around him that he perceives as living, we can see how, or rather we will see how, language is used in such a way that it may be somewhat unclear as to what actually happened to the individual. What we mean by that in terms of non-verbal communication is that often words which are analogous to speak or talk are used, and this may give the impression that the individual spoke or talked normally as they do on earth life. But we have a couple of cases here which show that these words are conflated and often used interchangeably, despite having very different meanings. In one case, a man suffering from organ failure speaks specifically of his telepathic communication with his father when he states, "When I went to look at my father, it was drawing with his eyes as well, as if I could see them both at the same time, and I had no pain at all. There was talking between me and my father, not words, but communicating other ways. Don't ask me what, but we were actually talking. I was talking to my father, not through words, through my mouth, but through my mind. He has clearly indicated a form of non-verbal communication." However, the same man, when asked a question directly, had a slightly different and yet important reply. When Penny Sartori stated, "Do you recall hearing anything while in this state?" he replied, "Only the words that my father spoke," and the gentleman saying, "He isn't ready yet." So here we have a clear case where if somebody had just read this question and answer section where the individual replied that he only heard the words that his father spoke, we could easily see how it could be taken that he did not speak non-verbally, that he spoke just as he had on earth life or during earth life. And yet, of course, this isn't the case. There was another case in which the experience states that they were surrounded by a whole stadium full of other beings or people or personalities. They were downloading information to them and they were absorbing that information, sending me gratitude. And then I said that I wasn't going to go back into my body. She then stops and corrects herself, stating that, or I communicated that to them. So, even though we would take it that when she says said, that is actually communicating something to them, she stops and states separately that, or I communicated that to them, clearly showing that the form of communication wasn't the form that the listener may expect upon hearing the word said. So, this is extremely important. This can impact research in a number of ways. For instance, some researchers have attempted to quantify the extent to which telepathy is present during the course of the experience, and I'm sure others will in the future. It's going to be important to take this research into account when putting such research together, because the numbers will invariably be skewed if we come at it from the perspective of assuming those who don't use the word not telepathy or non-verbal communication or thought transferal haven't actually engaged in that. We can see here in this case, study carried out by Kevin Williams, that he seems to think a certain amount of individuals did not engage in non-verbal communication. We would argue that 100% of them did. 100% of them always have, and 100% of them always will. And that it was more likely a misinterpretation of the use of language, which was the origin of these conclusions. He does go on to state that mental telepathy was a number 2 frequently occurring aspect, which again just shows how prominent and how important this feature is when considering the most prominent features of the near-death experience. Again, we must consider such an intriguing aspect of the experience in light of modern ideas about the brain and neurophysiology, in an almost humorous sense, by saying that which chemical in the brain describes why the individuals, past, present, and future, speak non-verbally during the course of their experience. Now, that may seem arbitrary and even conceited, but it gets us down to the core of just how mysterious the near-death experience is, and just how little its apparent skeptics seem to actually know about it. Of course, again, there's nothing wrong with skepticism, but we're not talking about true skeptics, we're talking about pseudo-skeptics who come to the experience having already concluded its irrelevancy and its materialistic origins due to their preconceived ideas about consciousness and how it's attached to the brain, etc., etc. We'll speak more about that in another piece. For now, it's just something to consider. Truly consider the origin of this outside of the framework of the experience being ontologically real. The origin of people speaking non-verbally when they have never done so in their waking lives. Again, this is a fundamental mystery. Even dreams, which are far more sporadic, incoherent in content and often nonsensical, are predominantly filled with experienced and recalled vocalizations of the same type used in the waking world. This is a considerable intrigue and not something which can be so easily explained away. The individual should have no expectation to communicate this way, and finds themselves communicating in this way whether or not they have come to terms with their situation, that of being near death. So the knowledge of being dead is not what precipitates the use of this form of communication, because there are cases in which those who do not yet know they are dead also participate. It's oddities such as these which should be studied in greater detail as the field moves forward. The main aim here is simply to show that non-verbal communication is a mysterious and important aspect of the near-death experience, which we should consider from now on as just as important as those other greater known features of the experience, and in many ways more important due to its novelty, due to its strangeness in relation to the life experience of the individual up to that point. And to say that vague references to the near-death experience being dreams, unreliable anecdotes, hallucinations, stories based on the individual's idea of an afterlife, death, really hold no water when we hold such strange features of the experience up against them. That will be it for today's episode, so thank you very much for listening to further explorations. Until next time.